how serious is the current budget deficit and mounting public debt problem relative to other times in U.S. history?
It's very serious. I mean, some people say, well, we had a debt level of 109% of GDP at the end of World War II, and it's only low 60s now. We've got lots of room. End of World War II, there had been rationing for 5 years. There was an enormous amount of savings. Most of what the government was spending money on was national defense, so there was a huge peace dividend. It was really easy to cut spending. And the deficit was reduced very, very quickly after the end of the war. And even still, with all of those things going for the government, there was a significant recession that was caused by the big cut in government spending at that point. Right now, we've got, the demographics are fundamentally different. At the end of World War II, the baby boomers were just about to be born, which produced an enormous expansion in the population. Lots of people working, paying into the system, able to pay the Social Security benefits that were offered first by the Roosevelt administration, and there were also a lot of productivity increases. There was another reason the labor force increased was because a lot of women entered the workforce. Well, none of those things are going to repeat. We're not going to have this big expansion in labor force participation by women because we're already in the workforce. The baby boomers are starting to retire, and they're going to put enormous demands on the government, both just because we have all these retirement benefits we promise, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, which pays for long-term care. So just because of the demographic factors, there's going to be an increase in government spending. But also, government pays for the health care for old people, almost all of it, and health care costs continue to grow faster than the rest of the economy. There might be a few mitigating factors, like more old people will be working than have in the past, but it is a very serious problem. We're not in the same situation we were in at the end of World War II. And the other thing is I think our political system is not functioning as well as it was then. It's not able to, at the end of World War II, we cut the debt really dramatically. Right now we have all these people talking about cutting the debt, but so far very little has been done.
You mentioned that they're talking about cutting the debt. Do you, in your opinion, are politicians aware of the seriousness of this problem?
Yes, they are aware of the seriousness of the problem. They're not necessarily aware of the causes of the problem. The fact that there's so much discussion about cutting non-defense discretionary spending, which is a tiny, tiny little sliver of the budget, about 10%, suggests that, we've got it's like somebody who has a weight problem and they're going to deal with it by cutting carrots out of their diet.
How likely do you think that the current administration in the next 2 years or so will be able to at least address this issue to some extent, basically do anything?
Well, they're good at addressing the issue. The rhetoric is awesome. In terms of doing something, it's a little bit it's a little bit more worrisome. The president has talked about debt as a serious problem. He's done it in the last couple of years. I know that he sincerely believes we need to do something about this, but the theory within the administration seems to be that we're going to find people in Congress who will be leaders on dealing with the debt, on tax reform, which might be a very significant part of dealing with the debt, and then the president will jump on board and say, yeah, me too. I think he's confused about his role in this process. Like, he's the leader. He's the one person that can get everybody to pay attention to him. And the president really needs to take some heat. The president needs to go out there and say, these are the hard things that we have to do. I mean, he's done a little bit of that. I mean, there have been big cuts in the president's budget in discretionary spending, and some of those will be really, really painful. But he hasn't shown any leadership on entitlement programs, and the tax reform he's talked about wouldn't do anything to reduce the deficits. He's just talked about cutting corporate tax rates by eliminating loopholes, which is a good idea, but it's not going to solve the long-term fiscal problem.
Mm-hmm. Well, in light of that last comment, how would you evaluate his budget proposal?
Grading the way we grade in graduate school, I'd probably give it a B, but a mediocre performance would have gotten a B+. So
Could you talk a little bit about the idea of a debt ceiling and kind of the role of Congress in setting the debt ceiling and the purpose of this restriction?
So the debt ceiling is an interesting case because there are a lot of things that on the books ought to help us to control the debt and deficits. I mean, there are all these budget rules that Congress has. They're supposed to keep it from, ballooning the budget deficit, and they would really work if Congress didn't repeatedly just say, "Oh, well, actually, we're not serious about that stuff." Then we've got the debt limit. So periodically, as the debt grows and grows and grows, it runs up against this limit. And the rules are that unless there's new legislation, government can't borrow any more money. And that should put real pressure on the government to do something about the debt. But the way it actually works out in practice is that it puts real pressure on Congress to raise the debt ceiling because the consequences of the government actually defaulting, which is what would happen if they kept the ceiling in place, are so awful that very few politicians will be willing to be associated with that. So, on the one hand, it's a good thing because it gets people talking about the debt. Maybe it's an education moment, but on the other hand, so far it really hasn't. It's been an opportunity for theater, but not much in the way of real action.
Could you describe kind of what you think the next 1 or 2 years will look like in terms of the debt and just fiscal policy in general?
The debt goes up. If you look at the president's budget, the debt goes up. If you look at what the Republicans have proposed, they want $100 billion in cuts in non-defense discretionary spending. The president's proposed only a fraction of that. But that's tiny. We're talking about, under the president's budget, we've got deficits over the next 10 years of $10 trillion or so, a little bit more, I think. Mm-hmm. So probably, realistically, the best case scenario, the best case scenario would be that Republicans and Democrats would work together and they'd start tackling the really serious problems of what to do about entitlements, tax reform, getting rid of a lot of the loopholes in the tax code and using that maybe in part to cut tax rates. We need to do that to just get a bipartisan consensus, and in part to reduce the debt. But then when I wake up, I think in the real world, if you looked at what happened at the CPAC conference last week, the meeting of conservatives, speaker after speaker after speaker said the one big thing they were dedicated to doing was making sure that President Obama isn't reelected. And that suggests that the scope for bipartisan compromise on really important issues might be really limited.